The sun was a punishing weight over the main checkpoint of Camp Victory. The air was thick with dust and the smell of diesel exhaust. Every vehicle was being stripped for inspection by guards with rigid faces and loaded rifles. A woman approached on foot, no uniform, no badges, no escort. She was stopped instantly by a young private whose hand stayed close to his holster. "Ma'am, you can't go through," he barked. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She simply stood there. And then, in less than 35 seconds, she made a move that changed everything. The gate didn't just open, it bowed. History made. It was a masterclass in silent power. Elena Ward was 32 years old, and she had a way of standing that made her look like part of the landscape. She wore a simple olive drab jacket, dusty cargo pants, and a pair of worn-out hiking boots that had seen more miles than most of the armored trucks passing through the gate. To the soldiers stationed at Checkpoint Alpha, she was a ghost, a civilian contractor who had arrived on a supply transport and was now trying to cross into the high-security medical wing without the proper paperwork. The heat in this part of the world didn't just burn, it crushed. It was the kind of heat that made the asphalt soft and the mind slow. The concrete beneath her boots felt like the surface of a dying star, radiating a heat that made the lungs ache for a single cool breath. Elena stood amidst the shimmering waves of air, her gaze steady, her breathing rhythmic. She had spent the last decade in environments where the temperature was the least of her concerns, places where the air was filled with more than just dust. But today, she was just an anomaly at a gate. She watched the dust motes dancing in the heavy air, each one a tiny witness to the rigid, unyielding structure of the base. In the world of the military, paperwork is the only thing that proves you exist. If you don't have a badge, you don't have a voice. And Elena had forgotten her primary ID at the base hospital 2 miles back. She was currently working as a medical support specialist for a new trauma synchronization project, a system designed to shave seconds off life-saving procedures. But to the guards, she was just a woman in the way of their protocol. The lead guard, a corporal named Reed, stepped forward. He was 23, sweat-stained and tired of the heat. His uniform was crisp but felt like a cage in the 110-degree sun. He looked at Elena with a mixture of suspicion and boredom. He had seen 100 contractors today, all of them claiming to be important. "I told you, ma'am, no badge, no entry. You need to step back behind the white line and wait for a security escort or head back to the transport hub." Elena didn't look annoyed. She didn't sigh or roll her eyes. She didn't try to use her status or drop names of generals she had saved. She stood in the shimmering heat, her gaze fixed on the inner perimeter of the camp. She wasn't looking for a way in. She was watching the people inside. "I understand your orders, Corporal," she said, her voice low and resonant, carrying a frequency that seemed to cut through the roar of the idling diesel engines. "I'm just waiting for the rhythm to change." Reed frowned, shifting his rifle to a more comfortable position. "The rhythm? What are you talking about?" "There's no rhythm here, lady. Just the gate, the trucks, and the sun. You're obstructing the flow. Move back." A few soldiers behind the sandbags started to whisper, looking at Elena as if she were a tourist who had lost her way in a war zone. They saw her as unimportant, a background character in their high-stakes world of perimeter defense. They judged her by the lack of a rank on her shoulder and the silence she kept. In their eyes, authority was something you wore, something that was shouted. They didn't realize that real authority is something you are. Elena noticed the micro-gestures of the guards. She saw the way they shifted their weight to cope with the heavy ceramic plates in their vests. She saw the dehydration in the deep cracks of their lips. She was performing a systemic audit of the checkpoint without saying a single word. She knew that in a high-pressure environment, rules often make people feel safe, but they also make them blind. They were so focused on the man without a badge that they were ignoring the soldier with a problem only 10 feet away from them. The air felt stagnant, smelling of hot asphalt, gunpowder, and the metallic tang of the desert. Elena didn't move. She was like a stone in the middle of a raging stream. The water flows around the stone, but it never changes the stone's nature. She was waiting for the moment when the protocol would fail and the humanity would have to take over. "Is there a problem here, Corporal?" a senior sergeant asked, walking over from the guard shack, wiping sweat from his forehead with a grimy sleeve. "Just another civilian who thinks the rules don't apply to her, Sarge," Reed replied, gesturing dismissively toward Elena. "She claims she's medical support, but she's got nothing to show for it. I'm about to call for a transport to take her back to the hub." The sergeant looked at Elena, his eyes narrowing. He saw the way she stood, shoulders square, weight perfectly balanced. Most civilians fidgeted under the sun. She was as still as a statue, but he was as tired as Reed, and his mind was on the convoy coming in behind her. "You heard the corporal, ma'am. Step back or step out." Elena didn't defend herself. She simply adjusted the strap of her medical bag and turned her eyes toward the guard tower. She wasn't seeking permission anymore. She was tracking a timeline that only she could see. A timeline that was about to run out. If you think rules sometimes make people seem unimportant, comment, "That is unfair." The heat of the afternoon was reaching its peak, a shimmering haze that distorted the horizon and made the armored trucks look like mirages. While Corporal Reed was arguing with a truck driver about a manifest that didn't match the cargo, Elena's attention remained locked on a young private standing near the heavy iron gate. His name was Davis, and Davis was fading. To an untrained eye, Davis looked perfectly normal. He was a young man, barely 19, standing at attention, his rifle held across his chest, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. Davis was no longer a person to the system. He was a coordinate on a perimeter map. But Elena saw the human heart behind the ceramic plates. She saw the way his jaw was clenched so hard the bone was beginning to white through the skin. He was a hero who had simply hit his limit. Elena saw the pattern of the fade. She saw the way his fingers were twitching on the grip of his weapon, a rhythmic, involuntary spasm that signaled a neurological misfire. She saw the slight, almost imperceptible tilt of his head toward the left, as if he were trying to find a balance that was no longer there. Davis was experiencing the early stages of a heat-induced neurological lag. His brain was starting to prioritize survival over consciousness, but his training was forcing him to stay upright. He was a bomb waiting to go off, and if he collapsed, his rifle would hit the concrete and the tension of the checkpoint would explode into a panic reflex. In a high-security zone like Camp Victory, a fallen soldier with a loaded weapon is a trigger for a code red. The soldiers around him were too busy with the traffic and the red tape to notice. They were looking at the ID cards. They were looking at the undercarriage mirrors. They were looking at the woman who wouldn't leave. None of them were looking at their brother who was drowning in the air. Elena watched as Davis's knees buckled for a microsecond before locking back into place. It was a sign of a vasovagal presyncopal event, a warning that the body's electrical system was short-circuiting under the thermal load. She could see the sweat had stopped pouring from his neck, a critical sign of anhydrosis. His system was shutting down its cooling mechanism. 10 seconds, Elena whispered to herself, her pulse remaining steady. She knew that if she intervened too early, the guards would just tackle her as a security threat. If she intervened too late, the boy would hit the ground, potentially discharge his weapon, or suffer irreversible brain damage from the thermal spike. She had to find the gap in the noise. She saw Corporal Reed turn back to her, his face flushed with heat and frustration, his patience finally snapping. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask you again. You need to clear the area now. Step behind the line or I'll have to detain you for obstructing a military entrance." Elena didn't look at Reed. She looked past him, directly at Davis. Her eyes were like lasers, cutting through the heat haze. "Corporal, your man on the left is about to go down. He's not being lazy. He's in the red zone. He's about to enter thermal shock." Reed scoffed, not even turning his head, thinking it was a tactic to stay inside the gate. "Davis, he's the toughest kid in the platoon. Just finished a rotation in the mountains. Don't use him as an excuse to stay at the gate. Now, step back." "He's not an excuse, Corporal. He's a casualty," Elena said, her voice taking on a new metallic edge. It was the voice of a commander in a field hospital. Look at the way he's breathing. He's using his accessory muscles just to keep his lungs open. His skin is dry, which means his cooling system has already failed. His internal temperature is likely hitting 105 right now. One of the other guards, a private named Miller, looked over at Davis, but the sunglasses hid the boy's eyes and the rigid posture hid the struggle. "He looks fine to me, Sarge," Miller said, shrugging. "Just the usual heat." Elena realized that awareness is the only difference between a normal day and a critical disaster. These men were trained for combat, for the loud and the obvious, muzzle flashes and explosions. They weren't trained for the quiet collapse of the human machine from within. Elena was a medical support operative, a code whisperer, and she knew that the time for talking was over. She saw Davis's rifle barrel dip 2 inches. His grip was loosening. His balance was gone. He was no longer standing. He was just falling in slow motion. And the 35-second window was about to begin. The moment where status ends and action begins. If you realize awareness is often the difference between normal and critical, comment, "I was wrong." The 35 seconds that changed the checkpoint began with a single, decisive step. 0 to 5 seconds. The breach. Elena didn't run. Running at a military gate gets you shot. She moved with a tactical glide, a smooth, non-aggressive motion she had mastered in war zones where any sudden jerk could trigger a nervous sniper. The metallic click of her medical bag opening was the only sound in a world that had suddenly gone into slow motion. Every movement was a prayer for efficiency. 5 to 12 seconds. The identification. Elena reached Davis just as his eyes rolled back behind his sunglasses. She didn't let him fall. She didn't grab his rifle with her hands, which would have been a lethal mistake. Instead, she used her shoulder to pin his body against the heavy iron gate frame, providing a third point of contact that kept him upright. She could feel the heat radiating from Davis's skin like an oven door had been left open. 12 to 20 seconds. The instruction read and 2 other guards swarmed her, their weapons ready, their voices a cacophony of "get back" and hands in the air. The tension was electric, a hair trigger away from a tragedy. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't even look at their guns. She looked Reed directly in the eye, her voice projecting a density of authority that felt like a physical wall. "Corporal, if you touch me, he hits the concrete and his rifle discharges. If you want to help him, grab his shoulders. Now. Give him space. Get his vest off. He's at 106 degrees. 20 to 28 seconds. The stabilization. The sheer command in her voice triggered a primal reflex of obedience in Reed. He had heard that tone before, from surgeons in the middle of a mass casualty event. He realized this wasn't a civilian interference. It was a professional intervention. He barked at the other guards. "Lower your weapons. Help me with Davis. Miller, get the vest off." In those 8 seconds, the checkpoint shifted from a scene of conflict to a scene of synchronized rescue. Elena directed them with micro-commands that left no room for doubt. Tilt his head back, clear the airway, get water but don't force him to drink. Call the base medic on the internal frequency. Tell them we have a grade 3 thermal collapse at gate alpha. 28 to 35 seconds. The communication, Elena used her sensor to verify Davis's core temperature again. Then she pulled a specialized cooling pack from her bag and snapped it against his carotid artery. She adjusted his posture to shift the blood flow back toward his brain. Davis let out a ragged, gasping breath, the sound of a system rebooting after a crash. The crisis was stabilized. The weapon was secure. And the atmosphere at the gate had been completely transformed. Reed looked up at Elena, his hand still holding Davis's shoulders, his face pale. The arrogance was gone. The suspicion was gone, replaced by a deep, unsettled awe. He looked at the way she handled the situation, the total lack of panic, the surgical precision of her movements, and the absolute clarity of her commands. She had taken a chaotic, life-threatening situation and turned it into a textbook procedure in the time it takes to walk across a room. "Wait," Reed whispered. his voice trembling slightly as he looked at the cooling pack. "Who are you? You're not just a contractor. No contractor knows how to move like that." Elena stepped back as the base medic team finally came racing out of the medical wing, their gurney rattling on the pavement. She didn't stay in the spotlight. She didn't look for a medal. She simply wiped the dust from her olive jacket and looked at the clock on the guard shack. 35 seconds. In the time it takes to sign a visitor's log, Elena Ward had prevented a weapon discharge, saved a soldier's life from a silent killer, and rewritten the operational logic of the base's most important gate. The soldiers who had been mocking her 5 minutes ago were now standing in a semicircle, their eyes fixed on the nobody who had just proven to be the most dangerous and most capable person on the base. Miller was staring at his hands, realizing he had almost shot the woman who saved his friend. He looked at Elena, his mouth open, but no words came out. The silence at the gate was no longer tense. It was reverent. She hadn't used a badge to get through the gate. She hadn't used a name or a rank. She had used a heartbeat. And in the silence that followed, everyone realized that the rules of status and paperwork don't matter when the reality of action takes the lead. 35 seconds was all it took to turn a civilian into a legend. If you believe action matters more than status, comment, "I am indebted." The medical team took over Davis, moving with the frantic energy that usually follows a near-miss event. They were surprised to see the cooling packs already in place and the airway already secured. Elena stood to the side, watching the handoff with a neutral expression. She was back to being a ghost. She wasn't shouting anymore. She wasn't leading the room. She was just a woman with a bag standing in the dust. The shadow of the guard shack stretched long across the pavement, as if the base itself was exhaling after the tension of the morning. Elena adjusted her bag, feeling the phantom weight of the situation still clinging to her shoulders. A black armored SUV pulled up to the checkpoint, the tires screeching on the hot asphalt as it came to a sudden halt. A senior officer, a lieutenant colonel named Vance, stepped out. He was a man with hair the color of iron and eyes that had seen far too much. He had been monitoring the gate's telemetry from the command center and had seen the entire interaction on the high-definition perimeter cameras. Vance walked past his guards, ignoring their frantic salutes. He walked straight to the gurney, checked on Davis's vitals with a quick glance at the medic's monitor, then turned slowly toward Elena. Corporal Reed stepped forward, his voice shaky and full of shame. "Sir, she breached the perimeter. I was about to—" "You were about to let one of your men die, Corporal," Vance said, his voice cold and sharp as a scalpel. He didn't even look at Reed. He kept his eyes on Elena, narrowing them as he recognized the tactical glide and the three-point anchor she had used earlier. "I know those techniques. I haven't seen them used with that level of perfection since the extraction in the Red Sector 10 years ago." "Agent Ward?" The term agent hit the air like a physical weight. The soldiers behind the sandbags froze. They realized they weren't looking at a civilian contractor or a clerk. They were looking at a veteran of the shadow divisions, the elite medical operatives who were dropped into war zones to stabilize high-value assets under heavy fire. Elena gave a small, tired nod. She didn't look proud. She looked weary. "I'm just a medical support contractor now, Colonel. I was just trying to get to the trauma lab to finish the sync project. I didn't mean to cause a security incident." Vance turned to Reed and the other guards, his face a mask of command. "She's cleared. Permanent access. No escort required. In fact, if I see her stopped at this gate again for more than 5 seconds, I'll have the entire guard rotation doing 20-mile rucks in this heat with full packs. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir," the guards shouted in unison, their voices cracking with a new kind of discipline. The change in attitude was instantaneous and profound. The soldiers who had blocked her path now stood at full attention, their eyes reflecting a respect that bordered on worship. They realized that the unimportant woman was actually a legend who had saved more lives in a week than they would see in their entire careers. Elena didn't gloat. She didn't mention the corporal's previous rudeness or Miller's laughter. She simply picked up her bag, which was now lighter because of the pack she had used, and started to walk toward the medical wing. Reed stepped into her path, but this time he didn't block her. He didn't put his hand on his holster. Instead, he snapped his heels together and gave her a sharp, formal military salute. The kind of salute usually reserved for a 4-star general or a fallen hero. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I had no idea who I was talking to. And thank you. For Davis." Elena stopped for a second, looking at the young soldier whose life she had just changed and whose perspective she had just shattered. "You weren't talking to anyone, Corporal. You were talking to a uniform and a lack of paper. Next time, look at the eyes. Look at the rhythm of the person in front of you. It'll tell you more than a badge ever will." As she walked through the inner gate, the dust settled behind her. The vehicles began to move again, the armored trucks resuming their heavy crawl, but the atmosphere at Checkpoint Alpha was forever altered. The soldiers knew that a ghost had just walked through their world and left behind a miracle. And the story of the 35 seconds at the gate would be told in the mess halls for as long as the base stood as a monument to her silence. If you believe respect is earned through action, comment, "I will live kindly." The story of Elena Ward reminds us that not every door is opened by a key, a code, or a piece of official paper. In our daily lives, we often encounter gates, barriers placed by bureaucratic rules, by social status, or by the narrow assumptions of others. We think that to get through, we need the prestige of a title, the right connection in high places, or the loudest, most dominant voice in the room. But true authority doesn't come from what is written on your ID badge or the rank pinned to your shoulder. It comes from what you do when the world stops making sense and the protocol fails to provide an answer. Elena didn't waste a single second of her energy arguing about the rules or demanding special treatment because of her illustrious past. She didn't get angry when she was dismissed as unimportant. She simply waited for the moment when her skill was the only thing that could save the situation. She let her action be her ID card. She let her precision be her badge of office. She proved that competence is its own currency. We often overlook the ghosts in our own lives. The colleagues who stay in the shadows, the mentors who listen more than they speak, and the experts who don't feel the need to announce their arrival with a trumpet blast. We judge people by their civilian appearance or their quiet demeanor, forgetting that they might be carrying medals of experience and scars of wisdom that we can't even begin to imagine. 35 seconds is a tiny fragment of time. It's barely a few deep breaths in the grand scheme of a day, but it was enough to dismantle a year's worth of military arrogance. It was enough to prove that rank is just a shadow, but competence is the light that casts it. True excellence is the refusal to be limited by the noise of the world. It is the courage to stand at the gate and wait for the truth to be the only thing that matters. The next time you find yourself blocked by a gate, whether it's a gate at work, a gate in your community, or a gate in your own mind, don't focus on the person stopping you. Don't focus on the lock or the lack of paperwork. Focus on the environment. Look for the fade. Look for the opportunity to provide value that no one else can see. Because the fastest way to get cleared through a barrier isn't to push against it. It's to become the one thing the people behind the barrier cannot live without. Real strength is quiet. Real leadership is clear. And real heroes don't care if you ever know their names. They only care that the mission is complete, the team is safe, and the rhythm of life is maintained. Be the master of the detail. Be the silence that understands the rhythm of the world. Be the truth. Because in the end, it's not the papers you carry that define your legacy. It's what the world becomes because you were there. Even if you stayed at the gate, invisible and ignored, until the exact moment you were needed to save it. That is the power of the silent professional. That is the lesson of the open gate. If you believe the people who act quickly and calmly when it truly matters deserve recognition, leave a comment below. And if this story reminds you that real authority comes from what you do, not what you say, don't forget to subscribe for more.